All right, welcome everyone. Welcome. My name is Tiernan Kane. I'm the president of Students for Child-Oriented Policy, so it falls to me to be as brief as I can with the introduction to this conference today. Now, it is a conference we're here for. If you thought pervasive porn was the name of an art exhibit or a film festival, you are mistaken. I won't say you're in the wrong place. This may be the best place for you, but you are misunderstanding the nature of this gathering. We're here for a conference to explore the personal and social costs of pornography. The motivation for this conference is the concern that the internet has opened the floodgates for porn, making it not only more widespread, but also more explicit, or perhaps better, more extreme. As we might expect in a commercial nation like our own, large-scale production of pornography has sprung up, and producers of porn seem to be targeting, or at least reaching, ever younger audiences. Joe Camel may be gone, but in his place we have 1,000 alluring substitutes, all of them less cool and less dressed. Now, to get some hard facts about the effects that pornography has on the bodies, hearts, and minds of Americans, we have brought together 4 panels of scholarly experts who will explore the matter from the perspectives of social science, philosophy, law, and religion. As you listen to their testimony, I encourage you to consider how we might respond with child-oriented public policy. Which is to say, if you find yourself nodding along, saying, "Good thing I don't look at porn," I ask you to catch yourself and reconsider. How would all this affect children? How would this affect my child? How would this affect my child when I'm not in the room beside him or her? Now, standing as we do for child-oriented policy, SCOP wants to suggest that policy should be made not with an eye to independent adults with the resources to adapt to the various struggles that may face them in society today, but rather should look first to, give greater weight to, the needs of children, who are more susceptible to long-term damage, more dependent on those around them, more likely to have their voice go unheard in politics. Now, if I ask you to consider kids often throughout the day, I also would like you to consider, at least from time to time, our co-sponsors. If you think that sponsoring an event like this is no big deal, then I have a SCOP account to direct you to. It actually takes a lot of work. We've received tremendous support from our co-sponsors, financial and otherwise, and I hope you won't mind me giving them just a little recognition before we begin with our first panel. First, I have to thank Notre Dame's Tocqueville program for the inquiry into religion and American public life, its director, Philip Munoz, its acting director, Patrick Deneen, and its administrator, the tireless and endlessly helpful Jen Smith. The Tocqueville program offers an impressive array of fellowships, lectures, and events, and I say that you should not hesitate to check them out. See also the Center for Ethics and Culture, another co-sponsor, whose unique exploration of ethics and culture, using the resources of the Catholic tradition, is one of the treasures of Notre Dame. We're thankful for their sponsorship. As far as undergraduate life is concerned, residence halls are a big deal at Notre Dame, as you all know. It's a privilege to welcome the men of St. Ed's, Stanford, and Fisher Halls, as well as Morrissey Manor and Zahm House, to be co-sponsors for this call to reflect on the costs of pornography. I should also mention at a much younger level, we're thankful to see here again St. Joe High School students and a number of other high school students. We had you here last year. We're grateful to have you back. Next, thanks to the Irish Rover and Sycamore Trust. They're not officially affiliated with Notre Dame, but I can't imagine the place without them. They are old friends of SCOP, and we are most grateful for their constant support. If you were looking for something to read, you could subscribe to the Rover or to the Sycamore Trust newsletter. They're both excellent, but you also might look into Ethica Politica, an online journal that aims to build up a culture of fruitful dialogue and a civilization of human flourishing. Bold goals. It's also a co-sponsor, and we thank them for their help. The Love and Fidelity Network, represented here today by Andrew Detter. Andrew, where are you? Is doing truly remarkable work, spreading to campuses nationwide, looking to build up the next generation of leaders for marriage, family, and sexual integrity. LFN is a unique organization doing unique work. We're grateful to have them on board with us, and we're grateful to have Andrew here with us. Please find him during one of the breaks. Finally, at long last, I have to offer our warmest thanks to Mr. George Strake. Mr. Strake is a Notre Dame alumnus, a Navy veteran, a very successful businessman, and an honorable public servant. His generosity made SCOP possible last year, and neither that generosity nor our gratitude for it has faded since. His devotion to providing a better future for today's and tomorrow's young people is, again, remarkable, and he has our fondest thanks. Of course, Mr. Strake and these fellow co-sponsors are not supporting a monologue, but a conference. So I believe it's time for us to begin the proceedings. I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to Professor Munoz, who will introduce our first panel, whom I hope you will now join me in welcoming.
Good morning. Welcome to our opening panel, Pornography, Addiction, the Industry and Relationships. As Tiernan mentioned, my name is Philip Munoz. I am the inaugural director of the Tocqueville program, and I'm a professor of political science here at Notre Dame. Let me reiterate Tiernan's thanks to all our sponsors, especially to the Love and Fidelity Network for all that you're doing here at Notre Dame and around the country. It's particularly a pleasure to welcome Andrew to campus, and I do hope that you'll seek him out. This panel will focus on several topics: the addictive nature of pornography, its impact on the brain, the size and scope of the pornography industry. We have three panelists from different disciplines, but I think you'll find their presentations will all complement one another. I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn right before they speak, so I'll introduce our first panelist now and then the other two before they speak. Dr. William Struthers is a professor of psychology at Wheaton College. His research lab interests are in the neural mechanisms that underlie behavior, behavioral arousal, and the processing of novel environments. He's published several important scholarly works and popular works on addiction. And I want to call your attention, especially if you're looking for an important book on the subject, his 2009 book, Wired for Intimacy: How Pornography Hijacks the Male Brain. Especially for the men in the audience, I highly recommend his book to you. So please join me in welcoming to Notre Dame Dr. William Struthers.
Thank you, Dr. Munoz, for that introduction. Just for you ladies, just know that my wife and I are also nearing completion on a work looking at how 50 Shades of Grey hijacks the female brain, and also the many ways that the male and female brains are not as dissimilar as we might think they are in this area of sexuality. One of the things that I stumbled into, I was a researcher who looked primarily at rats and wiring up how the sexual circuits in the male brain and the female brain, how they're put together, how hormones influence them. But when I began teaching undergraduates, it became very apparent to me that undergraduates didn't care about rats. What they cared about was people and human sexuality. And that's how I stumbled into this area. It's not an area that I think many of us go willingly, but it's an area that sometimes we see opens up to us, and we're given the opportunity to speak into it. So for those of you who are younger in the audience who are thinking about ways that you might impact the scholarly communities, or even areas such as policy, I'd want you to at least consider where you might go with this. Now, when an infant is born, the naked female breast means food. When a child is 4 or 5 years old, the naked female breast means mom doesn't have any clothes on. For the 10-year-old, the naked female breast begins to take on something a little bit different than just being in a state of undress. It creates a bit of anxiety because at the time of puberty, we have the brain going online into its sexual maturation process. And so what we find is that 10-year-old may be uncomfortable and not quite know what to do with the image of a naked female breast. We find that once you get to your 20s, as indicated here in these men who are staring at the monitors that are loaded up with pornography that they're browsing, we find that it's going to trigger a very different response as well, not just one of general, diffuse arousal, but one of specific and directed arousal. We're moving into an area where now we are beginning to kind of say, well, let's look at these faces here. We can look at these faces and see, well, clearly what we've got are some significant reactions. We've got pupil dilation. We've got the slackening of the facial muscles. We've got certainly something psychological going on here. Many men will talk about how psychology has a hypnotic effect on them. But what we want to do is we want to move away from just looking at the biological factors and moving now into some of the bigger questions that we as researchers face. When we talk about sexually explicit imagery, well, there's quite a bit of disagreement among many scholars, particularly if you want to put someone in an fMRI machine and show them nudes or pornography or whatever it is you want to call it. Well, we've got to have some way of classifying that. So sexually explicit imagery often involves the viewing of the genitals or the full view of the genitals, and that can be very different from what we might call sexually solicitous stimuli. If you consider if you're a physician and you're studying to be a doctor, you need to know the anatomy. So it might be appropriate that you would be able to look at the image of the naked human form, to be able to see the genitals. And we would call that sexually explicit, but we might not call it solicitous. There's nothing about the black and white picture of a naked person just standing there that says, come on, let's get it on, so to speak. It's just there for very clinical purposes. But you can have individuals who are not in a state of undress who can send sexually solicitous signals as well. We are moving away from just an understanding of pornography as basic nudity and nakedness, which is a place of vulnerability. Now, as I indicated earlier, trying to figure out what these cues are can vary from culture to culture, but there are many of them that are common as well. Think about the flirting that goes on campus. How do men and women show their interest in one another? Is there raising of the eyebrows and the smiling and the flicking of the hair or the puffing up of the chest, right? You can go on the internet and very quickly find 10 quick clues to tell you that she wants you, or 10 quick ways to tell if a guy's into you or not. Easy to find. You don't see newborns looking at those websites. You don't see 5-year-olds looking at those websites. You see 10-year-olds interested in them, but not necessarily tracking them down. It's the 20-year-old, the 30-year-olds who are looking at these websites. So when we think about the role that developmental exposure plays, what it can be is for young people, certainly in a time when they are critically developing these signals and the ability to kind of project them, number one, and also, number two, to receive them, that now we're moving into an area of sexual exploitation. Developmentally, children are going to be much more sensitive to these signals, and their ability to filter context is markedly low. Many people are looking at these new sets of neurons called mirror neurons. If you're not familiar with them, mirror neurons are a set of neurons that basically mirror my actions. So if I put my hand up, the part of your brain, if we'll use that language loosely, that causes your hand to go up, those neurons fire, but they don't trigger the movement of the brain. So this notion that we can learn observationally, that when I engage in a behavior, you see it, you mirror it, and now it's a part of your repertoire. That's a very dangerous thing for young people, especially prepubertal children, to be shown sexual acts or even violent sexual acts. They do not have the ability to understand what those acts are. What they will do is they will say, oh, look, there's mom and there's dad and they're naked and they're wrestling. No, that's not exactly what they're doing. They're doing something very different. But they interpret it through the filter that they have available to them. This is going to be something that will be discussed later on. Now, one of the first things that we can see when we look at the brains is, by the way, pornography is really, really good at causing brains to light up. Because as a general rule, brains are very, very good at detecting faces, they're detecting skin, and they're good at detecting sex. So if, and I won't do this because we're here at Notre Dame and other places I feel more freedom, but if you can just start unbuttoning your shirt and exposing skin, people, even the thought of it causes some people to get anxious. Because we're very, very good at picking up nudity. And we're also very, very good at picking up sexual signals, especially in adulthood. These are, this is from a study done over 10 years ago, looking at what happens when you put men, this is from men, and women in, this is fMRI, and look at their responses to viewing sexual images. Well, what we find is that there's a number of brain regions, some of them deep. This is going to be the ventral tegmental area, the midbrain. These two on the side are going to be the amygdala. This region is the dopamine-producing site that releases dopamine up into the higher brain regions when you, say, for example, take amphetamine or cocaine or something along those lines. The amygdala, this is an area that's oftentimes associated with negative, frustrated states, which is very much tied to the type of sexual energy that a person will experience. You see significant activity also here in the more caudal portion of the brain, those regions that are responsible for viewing as well. And one of the things that we noticed is that the male activity tends to be quite a bit different from the female activity. And we know that men, as a general rule, are very, very good at picking up visual signals. This is not to say that women don't pick them up. You can see that there is some activity. It's just a little bit different. And one of the better ways that we could look at female activity is we could say, well, let's just flip this and we'll make this very, very explicit erotica. Women tend to respond very, very well to erotica when compared to visual images. This was 10 years ago. This data is changing because the brain is flexible. We're seeing a rise in women that are showing this very masculine type of response now because the female brain is very fluid, much like the male brain is, but in this area especially so. And so in a couple of weeks, if you want to, which I hope you won't, you'll be able to go out and watch the movie of the 50 Shades of Grey book rather than read it. Because sex sells. Sex is something that we know activates the brain, and this caused people to say, well, if pornography, which is the supernormal stimulus where you can see hundreds of naked people very, very rapidly, well, might it be an addiction, like heroin's an addiction or cocaine's an addiction? And so we began to investigate this as psychologists. Those who work with clinicians say, well, we've got to have tests, right? We've got to have numbers because we're going to be looking at some statistical analysis and we want to know if this is real or not. And so we had the hypersexual disorder screening inventory. We had the pornography consumption inventory, which said, well, people are looking at porn either for pleasure, out of curiosity, because they're excited, or to avoid some kind of emotional distress that they're in. There's a number of them, the cyber pornography use inventory, the internet sex screening test, the sexual addiction screening test. Needless to say, all the methods and measurement people were very, very interested in this. And so it was considered for inclusion in the DSM-5 as hypersexual disorder, and it was rejected. That is to say that when you read the committee's reasons, there was an overall kind of sense that, well, this isn't a behavioral addiction in the same way that, for example, gambling is. But interestingly enough, in the back of the DSM-5, they are considering internet and gaming addictions as well. So they're not averse to it, but it causes us to stop and ask the question, well, as neurobiologists, how do we go ahead and investigate these disorders if they're not called a disorder? It's pretty much as we could look back here and say, well, with all these different measurement tools, every lab for itself, so to speak. And in our lab, we adopted the hypersexual criteria. And prior to the rejection of it by the DSM-5, what we found is that, no, in fact, there are actually some significant differences in men who show what we might call hypersexual disorder, especially where their hypersexual disorder is heavily oriented towards the viewing of pornography. So this question, is pornography addiction real? Is hypersexuality real? Well, if we assume that it is, well, we can see, and we have in our lab, that individuals who score high on hypersexuality will actually show greater impulsivity. They perform very, very poorly on this, for example, this one task, the Iowa gambling task. Iowa gambling task, you have 4 sets of cards, 4 decks. Some of the decks have very, very high payoffs, but very, very high penalties. Some of them have very, very low payoffs, but very, very few penalties. And the impulsive person will always choose the big hit, even though sometimes they're going to get hammered for it. And we show that these hypersexual men do very, very poorly. They always seem to go back for the big hit, even though it has the most severe penalty associated with it. Oops, sorry. Wrong direction here. We're seeing more and more that brain scientists are getting interested in these questions. Well, this is not just some kind of small Christian teacher at some agenda-driven Christian school. This is we're talking about Cambridge University here. We're talking about some world-class researchers are asking the questions: what happens if you are a person who is a compulsive viewer of pornography? Do you see that there are differences in your neurological responses and when you're shown an image? And in fact, what we are seeing is that, yes, that is what's going on. And I'll not bore you with all the details of these images, but if you want to, grab me afterwards, and I'll be happy to direct you to the article and to unpack it a little bit more for you. But the brain of compulsive porn users, the brain of compulsive sex addicts, if you want to use that language, looks very much like the response of a drug addict. We're seeing more and more as well when we look at the size of the brain regions. Another study that was published just this past year in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry showed that the size of one region of your brain, the right putamen, is inversely proportional to the amount of pornography that you view online. And this is just taken from the general population. They had an open call to people to be a part of a study, and individuals came in and they gave them the surveys, and they put them in the brain imaging machine. And what they found was that, I'll distill that for you, the more porn you watch, the smaller this part of your brain gets, and the more disrupted this circuit, which is involved in the regulation of behaviors, gets. So the press jumped all over this. Porn shrinks your brain. And as a good scientist, you have to stop back and say, well, is it that people who are already predisposed to having smaller, right putamen, we'll say, are more likely to be exploited and hijacked by pornography? I think that's a valid methodological point to make, that we have to at least stop before we kind of go that next step and say, this causes this. Perhaps now we need to look at, well, what's going on here? Because when we look at pornography and we talk about it as an addiction, and we use the drug language, right? You use a drug because a drug gives you the desired end, right? I take antibiotics because they help me fight the infection. I don't take antibiotics to give me, big muscles. That would be misuse of a drug, wouldn't it? That drug is not going to give me that desired end. But if I take antibiotics 5, 6, 7 times a day, I'm actually going to start damaging my body. The drug is abusing my body now. It's one thing to have a glass of wine to enjoy the taste of the red meat. It's another to take a glass of wine to try to build big muscles. And if I drink an awful lot of wine to get rid of my stress, say on a Friday night because I'm a student who's overworked, right? Well, I'm going to start doing some damage to myself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm addicted, that I'm an alcoholic. Because addiction is the result of use over and over again, whereby you develop a tolerance and then you have a dependency. And addiction is also marked by the craving of the thing as well, and the inability to stop, this emotional dysregulation. And so what we're finding in our research is that the majority of users of pornography are actually misusing pornography and progressing from misuse into abuse and from abuse into addiction because they're using the pornography as a masturbatory aid to self-medicate them emotionally in dealing with some sorts of trauma, stress, anxiety, to manage their erotic sensuality. Because they're impulsive, they just have the thought and they engage in it. They're working out or dealing with anger or frustration with their lot in life. And we can think back even just to this past year to the very unfortunate circumstances of that misogynistic young man in California who went on the shooting spree at the college because he just, hated women because the women weren't into him. Possibly might that be contributed to the culture, the pornified culture that we live in that makes young men think that this is what sexuality is like. So if we think about pornography addiction as really part of a behavioral spectrum from, on one end you've got normal sexuality, which is healthy when understood within its appropriate context. But sex then is used in inappropriate ways for inappropriate purposes. Pornography is this supranormal stimulus, especially internet pornography, that is changing the way that we have access to these sexually solicitous signals that arouse us. That arousal needs to be dealt with in some way. The cheap and easy way is oftentimes through masturbation to get you the orgasm, which is the great releaser from the stress and the anxiety. So the question, is pornography addiction real, is actually the wrong question. The only reason why any drug of addiction has any power at all is because the neural circuitry of pleasure is already present in the brain. Pleasure is there for eating, for drinking, for sex, for intimate human connection. A better question is, what would you expect? Why wouldn't it be addictive? Heroin isn't addictive because it's heroin. Heroin is addictive because it acts on these circuits. Is pornography addiction? Can you be addicted to porn? Well, maybe a better way of thinking about it is that heroin, cocaine, amphetamine are distilled orgasm that is injected. That's what they are, because you are made for these human connections. And pornography hijacks those and gives you this supernormal stimulus that causes maladaptive behaviors. And that is what pornography addiction is. So thank you very much.
It's really a pleasure for me to introduce our third speaker, Professor Mark Regnerus. Professor Regnerus is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and a faculty associate at that university's Population Research Center. He's the author of over 30 published articles and book chapters and some very important books. And let me just mention two of his books to you. Premarital Sex in America, How Young Americans Meet, Mate, and Think About Marrying, as published in 2011 from Oxford. Also published from Oxford is Forbidden Fruit, Sex and Religion in the Lives of American Teenagers. That was published in 2007, and that book tells the story of the sexual values and practices of American teenagers, paying particular attention to how participating in organized religion shapes sexual decision-making among the young. Let me add just a personal note. I don't know Professor Regnerus, but I do want to say the following. He is a heroic scholar. Here at Notre Dame, we're sheltered somewhat from the pathologies of modern American universities. Professor Regnerus has bravely challenged the reigning orthodoxies of the academy, and in doing so has displayed uncommon courage and fortitude in the face of criticism and adversity. Professor, your dedication to scholarly research, following the truth wherever it leads, is an example to us faculty members, and we're very much indebted to your courage, convictions, and your research. Thank you for coming to Notre Dame, and now please join me in welcoming Professor Regnerus.
Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm glad to be here. I have talked about sex and sexuality and sexual behaviors for the last several years. I've dabbled at the edge of sort of what is known socially around pornography and pornography use. Haven't written directly about it, although we have a couple papers on sort of a new estimate of contemporaneous pornography use, which I'll talk a little bit about today. But today I want to talk about sort of the personal and a little bit of the social fallout of pornography in America, with an emphasis. I mean, I'll show you some personal associations, but really my primary interests are what pornography does to, for lack of a better term, the mating market, right? So I dabble a little bit in economics without training, which is a very dangerous thing. But I care a lot about sort of marriage and how people come to marry and what it means and how people act within the institution. And so I'm mostly concerned about pornography as it affects that process. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Now, mostly what I'm going to use today is a fairly new survey that we fielded in January and February of last year to Americans ages 18 to 60. It's called the Relationships in America Project, and if you go to relationshipsinamerica.com, you can look at our report that was released in November. There's a couple pages on pornography use in America in that, and I'm going to expand on some of that today. But we don't really go into detail there about sort of its effect on the mating market like I will in a few minutes. So where are we at, right? I mean, I think this is the latest and best estimates of pornography use in America currently. This is among 18 to 60-year-old men. We talked to 15,738 of them, by the way. Let me just, okay. A bunch, right? Nationally representative, population-based. So we've got good estimates and an ability to sort of slice the pie narrowly to look at subgroups, etc., which we do in the report, but I'm not going to do a whole lot today. So what do we learn here, right? One of the things we did is, I mean, there's a lot of psychology to asking survey questions. We asked this the very last question, okay, in the survey. If you're going to put something tough to people, you don't start with it. So we put it at the very last, and we asked it in such a way that we were talking about intentional pornography use, not sort of accidental. I mean, I remember when we did interviews with teenagers back when I wrote Forbidden Fruit, you know, the kids would say like, oh, I accidentally saw something. Like, okay, now let's talk about intentional, right? And 10 years later, people are a little bit more open to talking about intentional pornography use. But we've got, at the 18-year-old to 23-ish, it's rising, it's elevated. It's about 45% said in the past week. Actually, it's the past 6 days, okay, as I'll show you in the next slide. And that increases slightly, so that like the peak usage, so I'm not sure it's statistically significantly different from 20 years old, but it's sort of like in the 30 to almost 40-year, a little 37-year-old range. And then it starts a slow decline, although if you notice, the 60-year-old men in the survey still were reporting past week usage that at rates exceeding 18-year-old women, which 18-year-old women was the peak in this. And when Bill, you talked a little bit about sort of restructuring of the brains of women, I know nothing about that. I immediately turned my thoughts to this slide. I thought, gee, I hope that's not happening here. It might be. I don't know. So we intend to reevaluate the same people probably in 3 to 4 years. And if this line holds 3 to 4 years, it'll mean like, well, you know, there may be some rewiring going on, but there's still this sort of aging effect that pushes it downward towards as women age. But you still see that this is more of a men's issue than a women's issue. I'm going to talk about men, sort of the association between pornography use and different kinds of marriage and sexuality-related attitudes for men today, not because it doesn't affect women, and I know it, but because it tends to be more closely associated with how men think about other things than it is for women. All right, so this is in the past week. We actually used it from a question of when was the last time, right? You could ask like, oh, how often, which I always thought is prone to underestimates. I wonder, it's like, you tell me when was the last time you did this, right? And we gave them the option of today, or yesterday, 2 to 4 days, 5 to 6 days, all the way out to I've never done this. And some share people just refuse to answer the question. And a humorous note, if there's any humor in this stuff, like this tells you that men were more apt to answer the survey in the evening, right? Because today and yesterday rates were about the same, right? If the average man had answered the survey question in the morning, right, it would not be at that rate, right? So we're talking about 10% today, roughly 10 to 11% yesterday, 12% 2 to 4 days, and then it drops up a little bit back to that, and this is where I cut off weekly, right? So this, when I'm talking about weekly, the rest of today, it's about the people who within the past 5 or 6 days. So if you wanted to think of it, it's somewhat bimodal. Past week, a while ago, but not that long ago, a month, and then it bumps up to it's been at least a year, right? I almost don't believe the nevers, but we're you know, for the sake of belief, there's a share about 15% of men who said, I've never used pornography, ever, intentionally. So our tendency is to paint porn use with a broad brush, probably too broad. It's unhelpful to put men in 2 boxes. those who have looked in the past year versus those who haven't. And some surveys, like the General Social Survey, tends to, they leave it too broad in terms of the point in the past in which they have looked. Addiction rates unclear, can't be learned from this. I said it in other contexts, and especially around the mating market. But the bottom line is I approached pornography as cheap sex, right? Meaning it mimics real sex poorly, but to some degree, at no cost, most of the time for the people who aren't paying, and no effort. And that many men, on average, left to their own devices, will track in that direction. Compare it a little bit to sort of this emerging penchant of men to text women, to ask them out or something like that, right? Left to their own devices, they would rather text than pick up the phone and call, because it is simpler, less painful. So technology presses people to do the simpler, easier thing that doesn't feel like it involves any investment. Older pornography magazines, costlier to get, time and effort. Our grandparents weren't inherently more moral, but they had a lot more barriers and a lot more social control. And when sex becomes cheap or replacements are found, even if they're poor replacements, when replacements are found, women, and I wrote this in First Things in November or December, women get put into a bind, right? I called it the pornographic double bind. They wanted to be in relationships with men, but the men suddenly have more sexual options than their forebears did. They were not trained to deal with things like this, cognitively speaking. And so many women feel compelled to negotiate over pornography in a way that they never would have imagined doing so in the past. All right. So I'm going to run through some sort of simple associations with this. These are not causal associations. These are sort of basic. Help us get a framework within this survey data of what is going on out there, right? So by religiosity, there is a connection, right? There's an association. The greater religiosity, the less men and women are likely to spend time with pornography in the past week, right? But again, just like in those previous slides, you see that the most devout men are still using at rates that dwarf the least devout women. But there's a linear association for both, obviously, right? So 53% of men who never attend church said, yes, in the past week I've used pornography. The overall rate, did I already use it? The overall between 18 and 60 was in the low 40%. It's in the report. Now, we also asked a question of people. Do you consider yourself more religious than you were 10 years ago? Less religious than you were 10 years ago, or about the same? So, and this is among men. Percent who are considered themselves more religious than they were 10 years ago. 12% of those used pornography in the past week, but 21% did not, right? I'm just making it dichotomous. I could probably get it into weekly versus past month versus never. But I just separate between the weeklies and the something less than weeklies, right? So the people who consider themselves more religious than they were 10 years ago are apt to be in the, I haven't used this in the past week, right? Now, what about the percent who agree when we ask a series of questions on marriage and marriage attitudes? It is a good idea for couples considering marriage to live together, right? Men who use pornography in the past week, 60% are totally on board with cohabitation. It's a good idea. They agreed or they strongly agreed with that statement. Keep in mind, too, that I also gave them the option of a middle category. They said, I'm unsure, right? You could call them neutral, whatever. They didn't disagree with the statement. There's about 20% of men fit the unsure category on all of our statements on marriage. So take 60, add 20, and you've got 80% of men who use porn in the past week sort of say, cohabitation is fine, or I don't know, maybe it's fine, right? Pretty high compared to 38% who did not use this in the past week. percent who agreed it is okay for two people to get together for sex and not necessarily expect anything further. It's a doubling. 60% of the men who used porn in the past week agreed or strongly agreed that this is fine. And again, an additional roughly 20% said, I don't know, maybe. A couple years ago, I wrote an article on porn use and how it shaped how men thought about same-sex marriage, right? I didn't analyze it with this data. That was a different data set. Same data source collected for different purposes. But we asked the question here, or a statement. It should be legal for gays and lesbians to marry in America, right? 52% of men who used pornography in the past week agreed or strongly agreed. And one of the focuses on men is that women on average are more on board with same-sex marriage than men in the country. And that couple years ago when I did that analysis, I controlled for a variety of other factors and still found that there was a significant pornography effect for men being more apt to agree that same-sex marriage is fine. And I came up with an explanation which I thought was particularly plausible about how this affects. I mean, it's not going to go the other way around. I believe that gay and lesbians can get married, therefore I should look at porn. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? I mean, there are selectivity things potentially going on here. But I made the case fairly effectively, as did somebody using the General Social Survey, that pornography use alters how people think about marriage, and they're more apt to agree to a definition of marriage that is out of step with what has been historically in America, right? Even though that is now a minority position. Anyways, as an anecdote, there's a professor from Indiana University who did this same analysis that I had written about in an essay. He did it in a journal article using the General Social Survey, another great data set. And I wrote him, said, yeah, thanks, this is excellent. And I wrote about it in an essay saying, look, I'm not crazy, people. People think I'm crazy. And then he wrote me back saying, can you just not talk? You know, I support, he said, I support same-sex marriage. And, basically, you're going to get me in a lot of trouble if I'm associated with you, even though we're saying the exact same thing. This is talking about the politicization of the academy, right, and the politicization of social science. What are you going to do? All right, this is the percent of people who are agreeing that it's okay for 3 or more adults to live together in a sexual... I'm sorry, I'm stepped ahead of myself. Sometimes permissible for a married person to have sex with someone other than his or her spouse. Note how I wrote that question. I wanted to... I didn't want to do this absolute, it is always wrong for people to have an extramarital affair. I wanted to just say, is it sometimes permissible? Give an avenue of opening. Most Americans are not on board with this, for which I'm grateful, right? 6% of men who don't look at pornography in the past weeks are not on board with this, but 17% are, and a fair amount who are neutral or unsure. So you can see that there is an association between pornography use and how people are thinking about other aspects of marriage. Okay to have, for 3 or more adults to live together in a sexual or romantic relationship. Non-monogamy. We're going to see it come back, okay, in a different form than the fundamentalist Mormons exhibited it way back in the day. 35% of men who used porn in the past week said, yeah, I agree, it's okay, or I strongly agree. And then again, another 20% are unsure. So we've now got among men who use pornography in the past week, which is about a majority, barely, upper 40s, 50%. A majority are either unsure or agree that non-monogamous relationships are fine. Abortion rate, there's an association here too. Men who use porn are more likely to support abortion rights. I'm not going to make a causal argument, but the two are co-occurring. Ever had overlapping sexual relationships, right? Where you were sleeping with one person and you started sleeping with somebody else before you stopped sleeping with that other person, right? Men who use porn more apt to say, that has been true of me at some point in the past, right? We have a time order issue, so I'm not going to claim any sort of strong link. But I think you can start to see that sort of non-traditional ways of behaving around sex and sexuality and marriage and thinking are associated with pornography use that is recent. This one is particularly, when I think about sort of marriage and fostering a marriage culture and discourage people from leaving marriage, this strikes me as significant. The percent of married men in the data set who thought about leaving their spouse in the past year. If they were using porn in the past week, double the number had thought about leaving their spouse in the past year, 23 to 10%. Now, it doesn't mean they did leave, okay? There's another variable I don't have on here about talking with your spouse about leaving, okay? So some people who think then move to talking, and some who talk then move to acting, right? But the association is parallel at each step. And does this lead to happiness like people kind of think, or not in quite the same way? 25% of men who use porn in the past week say, I am very happy with my life, versus 37% who did not. All right. Some thoughts about the marriage market, right? This is the slide that kind of bugs me the most. It has nothing to do with pornography per se, right? In the sweet spot of marriage, like marrying, 25 to 34. The median age is 27 for women and 29 for men. We see in 13 short years, the share of married Americans declining rapidly and the share of unmarried Americans increasing considerably. You know, I'm Catholic. I have no qualms with unmarried Americans, right? There's a vocation for people who wish to sort of remain celibate their entire lives, right? But that's not what's going on here, right? We're looking sort of at a marital train wreck coming, and you'd think, oh, they're going to come close, and then they're kind of going to stay. No, they've crossed each other in the past several years, and they keep going, right? Does pornography use have anything to do with this trend? Hard to say. Hard to say. I approach the study of mating markets by looking at sort of what I call our contemporaneous sort of bifurcated mating pool, right? Technology, beginning with contraception, but augmented by pornography, augmented by online dating, actually, and I can talk about that later, all serve to separate people from those who are interested in marrying from those who are, I'm mostly interested in sex, right? So the pre-contraceptive mating pool was just like everybody was in it, and if you wanted to have sex with somebody, you took some risks, and you're going to get burned, and you had to figure out if you're going to marry this person or not. I mean, most of the sex that occurred in the pre-contraceptive mating pool was people who were semi-serious about this relationship. And that's just not the case anymore. Contraception has made it such that we don't really have to worry about pregnancy anymore. So this is where we're at in sort of the modern mating pool. It's bifurcated in corners, right? You've got people who are interested in marrying, people who are interested in sex, and people are like, I'm okay with a committed sexual relationship. We don't have to be on their way to marriage yet, right? But it's not randomly sorted by gender. More women are in that corner, more men are in this corner, so the power dynamics get messy, meaning power flows, typically speaking, to the rarer sex, right? So women have a lot more power in this corner of the mating pool. They call the shots. Men have more power in that part of the mating pool, right? Because they're rarer. Right? So you might think, I have nothing to do with pornography. Don't look at it, not interested in it, etc. But this means it still affects you. Okay? Let me show you how. This is from a social psychologist study of sort of the economics of sex, which I've written about to some degree in the premarital sex in America piece, right? I'm actually interested in the individual factors. You probably have to look at those and find them humorous, right? The preconditions of market exchange here that men in general want sex more than women, okay? And you might think, oh, that's not true. That's a very unfeminist thing to say. Like, well, all the data still point in that direction. And if you look at pornography use and masturbation rates, masturbation is kind of the purest measure of excess sexual desire, and men will masturbate at rates exceeding women. So that is, in general, true. In general, men have resources that women want. Yes, but women need them less now than they used to. If any of the preconditions, that one is starting to crumble. Women are free to make sexual decisions, and people like to sort of figure out what other people are up to because they want to know the market price of sex, right? And you might think, why is he talking about market price of sex? But it matters, right? I tend to focus mostly on the market factors, right? The social phenomena, right? And so to kind of move us towards a closing, look at pornography in here, right? So men have easy access to pornography or prostitutes, which are low-cost substitutes. It lowers the price of sex, access to which women control, right? Women control access to sex. They are the gatekeepers. Men make terrible gatekeepers, right? Terrible gatekeepers on average. Larger pool of women than men. Supply exceeds demand. Think about if pornography saps some degree of male sexual interest and takes them off of the market, the supply of women grows. That lowers the price of sex. Permissive sexual norms in the culture, pornified culture, lowers the price of sex. Men have few opportunities for sexual satisfaction. It raises it, but pornography means they have more opportunities. It lowers it. Marriage is an expensive price for sex. If the market factors here are pushing people to lower the price of sex, what should we expect to happen? This, to some degree. So I'm going to stop there, and just to I'm not going to pin pornography on here, but people are starting to draw the connections with sort of delaying marriage, and like, why aren't men interested in marriage? Like, I mean, and people are starting to enter into their 30s and surprised at the low level of interest they have found in significant committed relationships. And I think that pornography is in the background, indirectly, via a pathway leading to where we're at today. Thank you.
We have just a few minutes for questions. We have a tradition at the Tocqueville program that we ask our students, our undergraduate students, and in this occasion our high school visitors, we give them the privilege of asking the first question. So if there might be a question or two, I'd ask you to come to the microphones. We have 2 microphones here. And then please identify yourself, if you're a student, your year, if you're a student, where you're a visitor, where you're visiting from. So a question or two for any of our panelists.
Good morning. My name is Sam Hyder. I'm a senior. This is for all 3 of you. Has there been any pattern between seasonal effectiveness of consumption of pornographic material? Have any of you noticed a pattern that way?
That's a good question. I haven't.
Unless you mean season of life, I would say probably post-adolescence is about the only season, and also looking at, we don't have the longitudinal data yet to follow people through their lives, so to speak, but my expectation would be that as men and women get older, that there would be probably less consumption of it. More so the case for women than for men.
Are you talking about like seasons of the year?
Like winter, spring, summer.
No idea. And I haven't considered it much, so I'm going to bet against it, but we could be wrong. The economist would, I mean, if anybody would know it, it would be economist about how
So yeah,
the paying
there's
thing goes.
two resources I would suggest checking out. One is the General Social Survey. I would see. Do you know whether that's always taken at the same time of year?
I don't.
I
I
don't,
don't
so
know how
you
long
could
it takes
see-
to field it. I mean, our
Yeah.
survey took, a week basically,
Yeah.
so it's not a good snapshot.
So
that
the
way.
General Social Survey is kind of old school, so it may be over a stretch of time. You could also look at the Pew Internet and American Life project that I mentioned. Some of their surveys are in February, some in May. So that would probably give you something. They do change their questions some over time, but if you can account for that, that might tell you.
The General Social Survey, though, their pornography use questions are have not stayed current in terms of they try to retain it so you can compare them across years, but the wording of it looks stranger and stranger with each passing year because we don't ask it and use the terms that they did back in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in another question or two.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Hermona. I'm a senior at Notre Dame. And I was just wondering, Dr. Struthers, you mentioned that the development of porn addiction comes from a misuse or abuse of pornography, internet pornography especially, and I was wondering if you thought there was an appropriate use of, or would there be an appropriate use of pornography in like the sense of exploring one's sexuality, or do you think that that would be more possible or feasible in an age before technology, like in the early part of the 20th century or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, by the way, and it gets to this which I think is a teleological question about what is the use of the image. Some images are more inherently easier to use, for example, like with the nudes for medical pictures. I don't want to say that the naked human form is a bad thing, but I do want to say that there's something about pornography, especially as the way that we generally think about it, that I think does not have any good use. That all forms of pornography inherently, and this is my personal opinion, more of as a moral and a theological opinion, that the majority of problems that people might have with sexual intimacy with their partners don't need pictures to be sorted out. And in many ways that strips them of the opportunity to deepen their intimacy with one another, because now I've got to perform like this person in this picture, and that brings other individual sexuality into that relationship. So I'd say my personal opinion, it's not a scientific one, it's a personal one, is that there's really no good use for porn. All porn is just something that's misused and abused, and at the end of the day really corrupts and pollutes the sexual intimacy between two partners.
Thank you.
Okay. Perhaps one more?
Hi, I'm Katya. I'm a senior at Notre Dame. My question is for Professor Mark Regnerus. Do you think there's any advantage to the separation of the mating market in terms of weeding out the men who are only interested in sex from the pool of those who want to get married?
Right.
Let me repeat the question. It might have been hard for people in the back to hear. Any advantage to separating out men, some men who are only interested in sex from the mating market?
Right. At face value, one can say, yeah, that's probably a good thing, right? The thing that I get concerned about is we're weeding out probably more now than ever before, right? If you think about the older mating market, I'm not sure how, on average, we're talking about roughly 9 in 10, probably men married, and the ones who didn't were either socially awkward, truly had something wrong with them, that would impede the formation of a regular marriage. But it probably wasn't around sort of profound sexual dysfunction of this nature, right? So today, I think about it, what I would really like to know, and it's very difficult to figure out, is how many men are off the market in those peak, sort of 25 to 34 years, who otherwise would be, but have taken themselves off. They're not interested in looking, or they're so sort of socially stunted by their pornography predilection that they don't, they feel it's awkward to approach women, etc. I think it's, if I was going to bet, it'd be somewhere in the 10% realm and maybe a little bit higher. But that's a guesstimate. But you think about what sort of incarceration has done to marriage in the African American community. It's a disaster, right? Because it has altered the sex ratio in the community, giving the men who live there more power to navigate relationships with women in that community in the ways they want, right? So their marriage rates have tumbled significantly. And I feel like pornography is going to do that in the same kind of way for the entire country in some ways, especially the mating pool. So one could say, yeah, there are some degree of men, we're glad that they're kind of off the mating market. But it's not a neutral thing. It's going to affect you, right? Even though you can say, well, at least I don't have to navigate that guy, right? But it's not as if just the ones who are off the mating market are affected by it either, right? So it's an inexact science that we're talking about. But when I step back and I look at what affects the mating market, I don't see how this doesn't. Thanks. Good question.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.